What's up, guys? Today it's going to be a very simple video. My son, who does all my editing, is out of town, so there's not going to be much editing on this video, but that's all right. It's going to be nice, easy, and simple. Today I want to talk about a great analogy to understand the Catholic viewpoint of justification, and how, if you understand the Catholic viewpoint of justification, you're going to understand that not only do St. Paul and James not contradict each other, but you're going to realize that they're actually saying the same exact thing and backing up each other, but they're understanding and viewing and talking about two different aspects of justification. So I want to share with you guys what I call the bread analogy of justification. So if you've ever made bread, what do you need? Well, you need flour. This flour represents us, okay? So flour's dead. Flour doesn't do anything. You put it in a bowl, and you know what it does? It sits there in the bowl. So in order for flour to move, in order for you to be able to turn flour into bread, well, you need a couple things. And the main thing is that you need this water that is activated by yeast. That's what you need. You need the water and you need the yeast. So Paul emphasizes very strongly, just as the Catholic Church does, and just as the Reformers do, that mankind in our natural state, we are like that dead bread. We don't do or act or grow in works of true righteousness, and we don't do acts of true love because, well, we can't do acts of true love because we do not have the divine righteousness of Christ inside of us yet. So when we are born, we are in this state of dead flour. Now, what you do to make bread is when you have the flour, the first thing you do is you create a well inside the flour. And this is what God does to us. The first thing he does is he like tills the garden. He creates in us and prepares in us a way to receive his righteousness, to receive his power, to receive the virtue of love, which is the yeast that we're talking about. This creating the well in the bowl of flour, this is what we call prevenient grace. This is grace that precedes our union with Christ. Now, once we, through faith, once we turn towards God and we accept through faith, because faith is the instrument in which we receive the righteousness of Christ, once we, through faith, turn to Christ to receive him, then what happens is the love of God is actually poured out into our hearts. So picture that bowl of flour, and picture you're pouring out this living, active water and yeast inside that flour, and you're mixing it up. All of a sudden, once you mix up this flour, and this flour now has become a new creation, it's become dough, but it's become dough that is a living dough. What do I mean by the living dough? I mean, it has that yeast that's active. It can rise now. Now it's starting to grow. The yeast, this live yeast, is working through the dough to raise the dough. Now, if I were to ask you, well, how much do you expect your flour to rise before you realize, okay, this is good flour to add yeast to? Like, do you ever get flour, put it in a bowl, and you say, well, this flour over there, it's not rising at all without yeast. But this flour over here in this bowl, it's rising without the yeast. So this flour, I'm going to pour my yeast into it. No, because there is no flour without yeast that rises. So that means that you pour the yeast into dead flour. In the same way with us, there's no works of righteousness that we do. There's no works of love that we do. There's no standard of holiness that we achieve that makes God decide now he's going to pour this love into us. Now he wants to justify us through faith. In Catholicism, through the Council of Trent, is very clear on this, that nothing can merit the grace of justification. Nothing that comes before our union with Christ can ever make us worthy to receive the gift of Christ. We are saved by grace through faith, not by works, lest any man boast. The flour is not at all united to that yeast because it raised, because it grew so much, because it was viewed to be so alive and so active. There is no such thing as active, living, rising flour before it is united to that living yeast. In the same way, there is no such thing as this holy, righteous, full of divine love person before they are united with the righteousness of Christ. So when somebody says, even when we hear a Protestant say, oh, we're justified by faith alone, the Catholic should understand, if you're saying we are united to Christ, and we are united and have this love poured out into our hearts, not in a meritorious way, but that we have it poured out into our hearts by grace alone, through faith alone, then you're going to absolutely be right. The Protestant is absolutely right, and the Catholic should be saying amen to this and not fighting against it, because this is what's known as our initial justification. There is that moment when the flour is united with the yeast. There is this moment through faith where we are united to Christ. And this, got a spider web there. This is to be understood as being done by grace alone, through faith alone. And it's unmerited. This is what Paul is talking about. When Paul speaks of justification by faith apart from works of the law, Paul is speaking about how there's no obedience to the law that is going to make us united to Christ. There is nothing that we are going to do. It's not keeping, if you keep the Ten Commandments so good, so holy, then God will find you worthy to be united to him. No, this is what Paul's saying. No, nobody produces their own righteousness without being connected to Christ, without having the righteousness of Christ united to them. No flour raises before it's united to that active yeast. So Paul, when he's saying, and he talks about how we are justified by faith apart from works of the law, he's saying that the flour rises because of the yeast united to it, not because of its own ability to rise. And the Catholic here should understand that what Paul is saying is absolutely true, and this is exactly what the Catholic Church teaches. Our initial justification, our initial union with Christ is by grace alone, through faith alone. It's not by works, lest any man boast. There's nothing you did that made you so holy that God had to unite his Son with you. He united you to his Son through faith while you were still his enemy. God takes dead bread and he makes it alive. God justifies the ungodly. In this aspect of being justified by faith apart from works of the law, apart from our own holiness, this is the context that Paul speaks of. And even if somebody understands this as, well, it sounds like Paul speaking of a justification by faith alone, and we'd say, oh, the Protestants just made that up. That's made up, and that's not in the Bible. No, this is what Paul's speaking of. Paul is speaking about justification by faith alone. And the Catholic Church actually teaches this. But the understanding is Paul is speaking about the initial justification here. He is speaking about the flour being united to the active yeast, the act of life, how the sinner is united to the act of righteousness of Christ, the righteousness of love that unites with the sinner. And this is through grace alone, through faith alone, and it has nothing to do with merit. It has nothing to do with merit. Our initial justification is by grace. The Council of Trent says that if we're saying that it's by merit, if we're saying, well, he gives us the grace to merit this initial union, then the Council of Trent says, well, then, as St. Paul says, grace, if it's by works, then, is no longer grace. Understand, and I've got to say this 4 million times, Catholicism teaches that our initial justification, our initial union with Christ, is undeserved, unmerited by grace alone, through faith alone. Now, once you make the dough and it's alive now, it's this active, alive dough. It's raising the living yeast, which is the righteousness of Christ that's poured into us. Now this is alive. Now this is living. It's not a dead dough. It's a living dough, because there is a difference between a dead dough that doesn't raise, and then there's the difference between that and between a living dough that does rise, because it's has the yeast inside of it. Catholicism is going to distinguish these types of dough, or these types of Christians, as there are people who have a living faith versus people who have a dead faith. Dead faith is what Catholicism calls fides informis. This just means, yeah, you're dough, you have an intellectual belief, you believe Jesus exists, you believe he died on the cross, you might even think, oh yeah, I'm going to heaven. This is just, it's an intellectual faith, but it's not alive. You're like a dough that looks like it's dough, it's in a bowl, but it's not going to rise. And the reason it's not going to rise is because it doesn't have any yeast in it. It has no life in it. It's just dead. Dead dough doesn't rise. Now you might have next to that dough, that bowl of dough, you might have another thing of dough. And this dough, let's say, has this living yeast in it. It has this living, righteous love of Christ living inside of the dough, living inside of us. This, the Catholic Church would call fides caritate formata. And this is a faith that's empowered by love. Love, the righteous love of Christ, is the yeast here in this analogy. This dough is alive because of the yeast. This Christian who believes, this faith is alive because it actually has that living love of Christ inside of us. Okay? And if you die with that yeast inside of you, if you die with that love of Christ actually in you, you will be saved. This is Catholic teaching. When Paul and James speak of justification, where Paul's going to say we're justified by faith apart from works of the law, and we're saved by grace through faith, not by works, lest any man boast, you're going to view that, and then you're going to hear James saying, no, faith without works is dead. Do you not see a man is justified by his works and not faith alone? And people are going to think, oh my gosh, they're contradicting. They're not, because they're talking about two different aspects of justification. Paul is speaking in his terminology of justification by faith alone. He's speaking, and you might say, like, he doesn't say the words justification by faith alone. Only time justification by faith alone is used, it's only used in James, when James says, do you not see a man is not justified by faith alone? Listen, we got to eventually get beyond the Catholic answers, apologetics 101. Paul, in his teachings of initial justification, that flour being united to the yeast, the sinner being united to Christ, it is the teaching of justification by grace alone, through faith alone. And Catholicism teaches us in our initial justification. What James is speaking of, why Paul is speaking about how we are initially united to Christ by faith alone, or by grace alone through faith alone, James wants to show, and he's warning people to don't be fooled. You might say, well, I'm dough. Yeah, but James is saying, like, yeah, but you might be dead dough. You might be dough that doesn't raise. If you don't raise, if you don't do works of love, if there's nothing living inside of you, then you could be dead dough. And your dead faith doesn't save you. James's whole point in his letter is he's trying to distinguish between fides and formis, which is a dead faith, compared to a living faith, a fides caritate formata. And James is trying to prove, when he's saying faith without works is dead, he's saying dough without yeast is dead. And the whole thing, even at this point, really, the Catholic and the Calvinist, we should really be able to realize that we're really saying the same thing. Even though I think, and you could see a certain Calvinist like today, like Doug Wilson, he's getting a lot of flack from within the Protestant community, because he's saying, well, we're justified by faith alone, but he's showing that we're justified by living faith. And he's understanding that faith isn't just this one-time thing. It's not that there was one day this flour had yeast in it and then that's it. Doug Wilson is recognizing how faith is something that is this continual thing, and it's this continually living thing. And he's saying how we're saved by living faith. And I want to say to Doug Wilson, amen. And that 100% is Catholicism 101. We are justified by living faith alone. James is trying to prove that you might have two bowls of dough. One is raising and one is not. And James' whole point is the one that's raising is alive and saved, and the one that's not is dead. The dead one is like a body without a soul. Faith without love is like a body without a soul. Dough without yeast is like a body without a soul. It is dead and it is useless. The question now remains, once you become alive in Christ, once you add the yeast to the dough, and now you have this dough with yeast, is there anything that you could do to cooperate with that yeast? Or is there anything that you could do to slow down the yeast or even kill off the yeast? I could tell you this, being an Italian who makes, made pizza and made dough, once or twice in my life. If you add that yeast in there and you mix up that dough, and you take that dough and you're going to just go put it in the cold, it's going to die. That yeast, you're going to kill that yeast off. Now, if you take that dough and you cover it with a towel, you put it in someplace warm. The old Italians sometimes they would turn the oven on inside, and then they would just set it on top of the oven just to get it warmer. What you're going to notice is that dough will start to rise. That dough, that yeast, will use that heat. So when we walk according to the Spirit that St. Paul talks about, after the yeast is added in Romans 5, when St. Paul talks about how when we walk in the Spirit, when we walk according to the Spirit, it's like you're taking that dough and you're just putting it someplace warm, and you're cooperating with it to make that dough rise. But Paul says, though, if you walk according to the flesh, well, then that's going to lead to death. So if you put that dough just in something ice cold, it's going to kill off that yeast. That yeast is going to be dead. Once you are united with Christ and you have this living faith, if you walk in sin, if you walk in unrepentant sin, and you turn away from cooperating with God, your living faith might be dead. Now listen, there's flour that has no faith. There's dough that has faith but has no yeast. And then there's dough that has faith and has the living yeast. Only one of those are saved. Catholicism does teach there are people who became born again. They went from flour to dough, and they had at one point that yeast in it. and they allowed that yeast to die. And the more and more we cooperate with the yeast, which is that righteousness, which is this justice, the more and more our justification strengthens. And we can say, just as that raising dough can grow in the yeast, can allow that yeast to allow it to grow, the Catholic can say that we can increase in justification. Now, when we talk about justification, when we talk about the dough with the yeast, what we have to understand is that there's two aspects of this. Let's even say three aspects of it, really. Number one aspect, when the flour first became dough, it had the water added to it, and it had the yeast added to it. This became dough. This is the initial justification. This is the moment it went from flour to living dough. We would call this in Catholicism the act of justification. Now, as that dough is raising, as that yeast is raising, you're warming that dough, and it's raising more and more. It's cooperating with the yeast more and more. This virtue now that this dough has, the ability, the gift, the power, the strength, the habit it has to grow now, because it has the living yeast in it, the Catholic's going to call this the habit of justification. So there's the habit, which is the dough's ability to rise. This is our ability to grow in righteousness, our ability to do acts of righteousness, the virtue we have now of love inside of our hearts, and cooperating with this, we can truly grow in that habit of justification. But that's different from the act of justification, when we went from being dead to alive. Paul, when he speaks of justification by faith alone, by grace alone, by grace alone, through faith alone, he is speaking about the act of justification. And the Catholic believes that the act of justification, us uniting to Christ, is by grace alone, through faith alone. And we don't merit it, and we don't deserve it, and we didn't earn it. But Paul is speaking about those who do not cooperate anymore with Christ, and therefore their faith is dead. This is why his warning in James 1 is turning towards sin in a way that leads to death. He's saying that dough that's alive with the yeast in it, it can turn towards the coldness to a point where the yeast actually dies. This is what James's warning is in James 1. When he says that when we get tempted and we turn over to our desires, how our desires then it conceives sin, and then sin, when it reaches full maturity, gives birth to death. What dies in the dough doesn't explode. Just the yeast inside of it, that active yeast inside the dough, dies. When we have this faith that's alive, when we turn towards unrepentant sin, it's not that we become an atheist. It doesn't mean that you just go back to being flour. It just means the yeast dies off. The love of Christ we kill off inside of us. This becomes a dead faith. And now James is saying, well, you're like a body without a soul. They're actually saying the same thing. If you read James 1 and 2 in light of Paul in Romans 5 and Romans 8, you're going to realize that they're saying the same exact thing. This is why Paul always gives warnings about don't go into these types of unrepentant sin, because if you do, they lead to death. He always, though, acknowledges you can't kill something that's not alive. So you already were dead. Then you come to life by grace alone, through faith alone. And now he gives a warning not to go into these things that bring death. So if somebody's taking the approach that Paul means we're justified by faith alone, to the point of even once you're united with Christ, there is nothing you can do or not do that will either strengthen or kill your union with Christ. Now I would say you have misread Paul, and you have confused St. Paul's initial justification. You have confused that with the whole ongoing process of justification. And we understand that there's the beginning of justification by grace alone through faith alone. There is the this ongoing cooperation of justification, which is the habit of justification, and then our final justification, which will be glorification. So I hope this helped you guys. I hope it made sense to you guys. My phone's dying here, so I'm going to stop the video short. So remember the bread analogy, and it shows you how we are saved by grace through faith, and this unites us to Christ, which then makes us have this living faith, and we just need to supplement that faith, like Peter says, keep it alive. All right, guys, peace out. God bless. See ya.